Time we talked about Machiavelli. We looked at what Machiavelli thinks the ideal political ruler looks like, or how they operate, what their strategies are. Normally what I like to do in this unit is I like to either go over feminism or men's issues. Well, y'all chose to look at the reading on men's issues, so that's what we're going to be discussing today. To do that, we're going to look at a chapter in Warren Farrell's book, The Myth of Male Power. And I'm going to show you a clip today as well to help give you a better sense of some of the questions and ideas that Farrell is wrestling with in this book. I'll start by giving you some general notes about what this book is about, and then we'll get into the data and the evidence that Farrell provides for a lot of his arguments here. So Warren Farrell is a writer, political theorist. I believe he got his doctorate in political science from a university in New York. I can't remember which one. But he actually started out as a staunch supporter of the women's liberation movement. Warren Farrell is the only man who has been elected 3 times to be the leader of the National Organization of Women in New York. And so for many years of his life, he was a feminist, a supporter of the women's movement, of women's liberation. But slowly, as he got older, he began investigating not just the issues that women face, but also the issues that men face and boys face in society. And he kind of transformed in his career from being just a supporter of the women's liberation movement to also being a supporter of highlighting the different issues that men specifically face. His newest book is called The Boy Crisis, and it's about how boys are falling behind in school, about how they have higher dropout rates, higher failing classes, how women now make up the majority of college graduates and high school graduates. But today specifically, rather than just talking about education, we're going to look at some of the primary arguments and views of the men's rights movement. Farrell thinks that we need to re-examine society from the male perspective, not just looking at it from the feminist or the female perspective. He thinks accurately portraying both sides of what it's like to live as a man and what it's like to live as a woman has been missing from the feminist literature. And in part, this is what his book is meant to provide to the reader. Welcome.
Hi.
He argues that feminism has been really quiet on what men's issues are. And insofar as that is true, feminism has misled many people into thinking that men aren't disadvantaged in any ways in society. He doesn't say that it's feminism's fault, though, because one of his catchphrases, if you can call it that, is women cannot hear what men do not say. And so he's big on trying to get men to express what their experience is like in this society, express the kinds of challenges and expectations that they face. And you could also argue that his book is trying to do that for people, to highlight not only men's issues, but to get men to be more comfortable with expressing what it's like to live in a society from their perspective. Formerly a writer and a lecturer on women's issues, Farrell has come to believe over his long career studying the nature of society and trends in society that society is actually sexist to both men and women in different ways, and that men and women have varying levels of power and privilege depending on the different domains that you're looking at. It's an overly simplistic picture, Farrell thinks, to just characterize men as oppressors and women as oppressed. Rather, men and women are oppressed in different ways, and it's not always true that men are the ones that are the victimizers and women are the victims. On account of this, Farrell thinks that feminism has misled people to believe that women don't enjoy any advantages that men enjoy. And he thinks that, again, this perspective on what it's like to feel certain expectations on how men are supposed to live their lives are missing from the feminist literature. And therefore, the kinds of educational and career paths that men are compelled to take on in order to live up to the traditional sex role that is expected of them. And so I'm going to go through a few of the statistics that Farrell brings up to support this view that society is sexist to both men and women in different ways. This view isn't going to be totally balanced that I'm going to present to you, because as Farrell says in his book, the book is not balanced. It's meant to achieve balance on these issues. So he really leans heavily into describing what it's like to live as a man and why male life in Western society is seen and treated as disposable. Y'all got this written down? Maybe? I will upload my teaching notes later, so if you don't copy it all down, that's okay. So now let's go through some of the pieces of evidence that Warren Farrell provides in the introduction to this book and the first chapter of this book, The Myth of Male Power. The first thing that Farrell tries to convince the reader of is that, like women, men have become conditioned to follow a certain traditional sex role that constrains their life and their educational and their career paths. Like women, they feel social pressures to act, to dress, to behave in a certain way. They are told that living and acting according to these traditional masculine roles and behaviors is going to give them power in society. It's going to get them a certain status or a certain wealth. But one of the things that Farrell's trying to argue in this book is that what men are taught to perceive as something that's giving them power or control over their life is actually doing the opposite. And he defines power as control over one's life. Instead, he thinks that every successful society that has ever existed has existed because it's trained its men and its boys to be disposable. To be disposable in war, to be disposable in workplace deaths, to be disposable in taking on all of the dangerous jobs, the jobs that people don't want, and to basically be used as a resource in order to prop society up.
Didn't he use the male-only draft in this to examine that too?
Yeah, he does bring up the draft. That's one thing that we'll mention here in a little bit. And Farrell provides a lot of different pieces of evidence for this view, that men are disadvantaged in various ways.
One thing that bothered me in this reading is, at least, who set up, like let's talk about like the male-only draft. Who set that up? Other guys. Like, it's never, like, I just don't understand how, I don't know, it can be, because like, with feminism and like looking at women's rights, it's always been the other sex that's been, putting all of those roles on that. But I mean, this is an issue of men, making other like men in that, disposable role. I don't know. I just don't understand why. I don't know.
Well, we'll talk about this more as we go through. But think about it this way. All the men who are in this room right now, which kind of a more progressive picture would paint as oppressors, do you think that we have any power over how society works? Or the kinds of expectations and roles that are placed on people?
I don't think that they have power over it, but I think that it's easier for them to get to that position of power.
Okay. As we'll see, I'm going to play a clip for you in a little bit. One of the people in this clip argues that the reasons why men occupy what we would call places of authority and power in our society is because this has been men's responsibility and obligation to do so. Because men have always been the ones to go out and make a killing, whether it's on Wall Street or in the forest, to do the nasty, dirty jobs, to defend society in war, to take on a leadership role. Whether or not you agree with that, I want you to just wait, because we'll come back to it. But just kind of think about that for a second.
So kind of go off of what Andy was saying, I feel like men have always had the advantage over females. I mean, just look, like, women got their right to vote in the early 20th century. Like, they've always had the upper hand. So yeah, a woman could have went to Wall Street, but at the same time, they would have been like, you know, they would have been discriminated against by men because, oh, a woman's in Wall Street in the early 1900s, or you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
we would have
yeah.
got tons of shit for that, and I don't think that's right because society has been long in favor of men over women, and it should have just been we're all equals regardless of gender. So it's goddamn bullshit.
Yeah, and Farrell would agree with you. Yeah, he thinks that the fact that women have been disadvantaged for such a long time, haven't always had the same rights that men have had, that has been a catastrophe, a disaster. But what he thinks now is that people aren't actually looking at the different ways that men are being disadvantaged in society. He thinks both men and women are disadvantaged in different ways. Maybe you'll be convinced if I go through some of these things. How about this? In the US, only men are required to be drafted into war. Women are not. Could we argue that that's a form of gender discrimination?
Yes. Absolutely.
Ren. I could not write today. Men are 2 to 3 times more likely to be victims of war. Do you think any man wants to be a victim of war?
No.
Up to age 9, girls and boys commit suicide at roughly the same rates. But from ages 10 to 15, boys commit suicide twice the rate of girls. From 16 to 19, 3 to 4 times the rate of girls. And from 20 to 25, 6 times the rate of women. Men are also 2 to 3 times more likely to be homeless. I'll get to your question in a bit, stuff here. I'm just going to put some more stuff up here. Men and boys are 2 times more likely to be the victim of violent crimes, 3 times more likely to be the victim of murder, and when we include activities in prisons, men make up the majority of people who are sexually assaulted and raped. So these are some of the ways that men are disadvantaged in society because they are seen as disposable, Warren Farrell argues. But there are more ways, other ways in which men are disadvantaged. Economically disadvantaged, socially disadvantaged, biologically and familially, you might say, disadvantaged. For example, when it comes to economics, female heads of households have more net worth than male heads of households on average. Women possess more control over consumer spending than men do across almost every category. And what is bought is primarily bought for women. 70 to 80%, I believe, of all consumer purchasing decisions are done for a woman or by a woman for herself. Stay-at-home women, Farrell argues, possess more control over their work life than men do at their jobs, and more job security than men. Men are not allowed to critique or get angry at their boss, whereas women are allowed to get angry at their boss, the husband, when he comes home, right? And then there are a bunch of medical facts that we could lay out, or that Farrell lays out, rather. In developed countries, men on average die 7 years before women do. Men are more likely to be burdened by illness, suffer chronic illnesses, and require emergency services than women. Men have roughly a 2 times higher rate of addiction across all addictive drugs. While breast cancer and prostate cancer affect male and female populations equally, breast cancer receives more than twice the amount of funding that prostate cancer does. Women can choose to have children, that is, they have a certain reproductive freedom in our contemporary society, whereas men have little to no say whether they father a child at all. Women possess more control over raising children, Farrell argues, and therefore, to a large extent, what the next generation is going to look like. And he says that trials over custody and divorce court are biased against men. Let me take a moment to write some of this down on the board. That was a good catch, right? So if we define power, Farrell argues, as control over one's life, insofar as men are more likely to die on the job, more likely to die in war, more likely to suffer and die of disease, more likely to be addicted, more likely to be homeless, men, it would seem, have a lot less control over their lives than feminism paints it out to be. Farrell argues in this book that, and remember, this guy was a feminist, okay? He would still call himself a feminist insofar as he supports equal rights and protections for women. But he would argue in this book that insofar as feminism tries to paint men as oppressors, that is an incorrect picture of what's actually happening. Depending on the domain in question, he's going to say that men have some advantages in some places, women have some advantages in some places, and it's too simplistic a picture to say that men are simply oppressors and women are simply the oppressed. Because both genders, both sexes, he would argue, feel constrained and confined to live up to certain gender roles that have been placed on them. And a lot of this comes about, Farrell thinks, because men feel expected to take on the protector-provider role that society has placed on them. And so Farrell is saying that, look, society is imperfect. Ideally, what we should be doing is trying to liberate both sexes from the gender roles that have been placed on them. Not just one. Because so far, on account of all of the waves of feminism and the women's liberation movement that have occurred, women have by and large been liberated from their traditional sex role, but men have not been liberated from theirs.
If you want to save discussion for later, I can wait.
Okay, I'm going to show a clip after a little bit, and then we'll go into a big discussion about all this.
All right, because I have something that never mind. I'll wait.
Okay.
Okay, so back to the point I was gonna make earlier. So like, yeah, I feel like the whole men are only drafted thing just goes back to the whole, oh, they're the protectors, and then the moms are the ones that stay at home and look
Right.
over the kids, and like, I feel like that's just kind of like a, like they did that to themselves issue, in a sense. Like past generations inflicted that viewpoint onto.
Ah, okay, so
You know
past
what I mean?
generations, right? Does that include both men and women?
I'd say more so men, but I don't necessarily know who made the draft, and I'm assuming a lot of men made it, but females could have made it too, so I don't really know if I have the right to just say it's all men. because I-
Undoubtedly, it was males who created the law, right?
So then it was men that
So then the question is,
did that.
what were they influenced by to create that law?
Chivalry.
I would argue religion.
Their own power trips? Or is it because they felt like they were expected to take on this role?
Or because they wanted to.
I would say it's a religious thing. Well, go back to the Bible. Let's go back, where we live in a very Christian-inspired, society. So if you go back to the Bible, it was a patriarchy. The fathers held, control of everything. Husbands, whatever, your wife. Take your wife. But at the same time, who wrote the Bible? Guys.
Well, it depends on who you ask.
It depends on who you ask. It depends on who you ask. But if you look at where we are now, with how it's been passed down, and at least in Catholicism, which is the largest branch of Christianity, it was all male apostles. No one looks at Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is perceived as this slut,
Right.
that went around. When in all actuality, in historical context, she's not. She was Jesus's favorite apostle, and she did some of the most evangelizing out of all of the apostles, but who is not written in most Bibles today? Oh, Mary Magdalene, she's left out.
Because they're biased.
So that's what I have to say about that, but we'll shelf discussions.
No, I thank you for bringing that up. I'm just trying to get all this on the board. I'm not trying to ignore you at all.
I also want to preface that I don't think men have it all easy. I'm very much of the belief that there are stuff in society that we need to work on for equality for both genders.
Again,
But-
Farrell's not trying to put the view here that men are oppressed. what he would say is that men and women are disadvantaged in various ways. And that the society that we have created that imposes certain gender roles on people has been a dual operation. It has been created by both men and women. And so to characterize the society that we live in as just the patriarchy, or as just something in which men have the power, he thinks is false, because both men and women in the past and now have contributed to the way society is, and what norms become legitimized and reproduced, and what roles become legitimized and reproduced. Yes, Steph.
Okay, would he argue then that like men have they're more likely to be burdened by illness because they suffer from more chronic stress because of the roles that they take on?
Quite possibly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Men do all of the logging, the majority of the construction, the bricklaying, the ditch digging, the garbage collection, all of the dangerous jobs. Men make up, I believe we're going to get to in a little bit, 95% of all workplace deaths, 99% of all wartime casualties. Not casualties. If we include everybody that's ever died in war, including civilians. But combatants. And then he also gets into, in his book, The Boy Crisis, how men and boys are being educationally disadvantaged. Men and boys, he argues, feel certain social expectations, as we have been saying, to take on this provider and protector role. And so that constrains their educational paths and what career they end up taking. Currently, in all 58 developed countries, boys are doing worse in school than girls. Boys fail classes at higher rates. They're failing in writing and reading and arithmetic more than girls. They're dropping out of high school at higher rates. They have lower college graduation rates than girls. Girls make up now the majority of college students. Boys are 5 times also more likely to experience juvenile detention than girls. And so Farrell prompts us to ask, if these things were happening to women, you can be sure there'd be a huge uproar about how society is oppressive and there's a patriarchy. But are any of these issues being talked about in our society? How men and boys are falling through the cracks? How boys are more likely to be diagnosed and then medicated for ADHD or Ritalin? Are any of these things being talked about? And so Farrell asks us to consider, is the story that we've been offered, in which men are simply the oppressors and have all the power, is that true? Or is it true rather that each gender, each sex has its own challenges and its own privileges depending on the domain? For example, think about the Titanic. Did you know that women, a higher percentage of women survived the Titanic over children? They always say women and children first, right? Onto the lifeboats, off of the planes. Another example, Farrell thinks of male disposability. The fact that society relies on treating males as disposable. And that men have taken on this role voluntarily. But they've been not brainwashed, but socially conditioned to take on these roles.
I'd argue it's a respect thing because females never really had the upper hand and they were disadvantaged for so long, so then that's kind of their way of making us feel that we're equals, or making us feel a little better in some way, perhaps is saying women and children first. So
Wait, can you say that again?
I'd argue it's more of a respect thing because we've
What
been
is?
disadvantaged for so long. The women and children first.
Oh,
You know
okay.
what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I just didn't know exactly what you were talking about when you said it.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. yeah, maybe it's maybe you could view it in part as kind of an olive branch because of the way that women have been treated throughout history.
Like they feel bad.
Right?
Yeah. Good point.
And so on account of all these factors, Farrell argues not that men are the oppressed sex in society, but rather, again, that if we want to achieve a more holistic, accurate view, we need to recognize the different ways in which men and women are advantaged and disadvantaged. It's an overly simplistic picture, he thinks, to just cast men as oppressors. And I'm going to play a clip for you here in a little bit from a documentary exploring the men's rights movement to try to highlight some of the main issues that are the target of people who are bringing up these social issues today. I'm abbreviating educational, edu. In addition to all these, Farrell provides a lot more evidence in support of this position of developing a more holistic view of the situation. We hear a lot about domestic violence and that we need to stop domestic violence against women, right? Well, according to CDC statistics, one in 3 women will experience domestic or intimate partner violence during their lifetime. Do you know what the statistic is for men?
2 and 3.
1 in 4 to 1 in 3. Almost the same rate. Yet we don't hear about domestic violence against men, right? And while there are over 2,000 women's shelters in the U.S., there are only 2 shelters for men in the U.S.
Where are they at?
One's in Arkansas. I know that.
Is that because, like, in Arkansas, they have a higher rate to domestic violence?
I have no idea. Does anybody know if they do?
Anybody want to input on that, or no?
I mean, it's Arkansas, so you can figure that a lady will pick up a pitchfork real quick and, stab a man a few times.
Okay, full of stereotypes, okay.
Not stereotypes, they're like 90% farmland. I don't doubt it's happening.
Okay.
I know at least in New Jersey, in the domestic violence courts, it's very hard for men to even get their cases looked at.
Right.
Let alone get the charities or any of that extra support, say if like a man can't afford to get a lawyer. It's very easy for women to get that lawyer and get that legal support. Like you wait in the waiting room and you got like 4 like caseworkers like, hey, you need help, I see. But for guys, it's a lot harder.
And it's more of a case of money acquisition then too, because a lawyer's not going to touch a case that they know they're probably going to lose. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
Unless they're a public defender, but they don't get a choice in that sense.
Yeah.
There is a prevailing view in our society that women are naturally going to be better parents to kids. And so the courts tend to be biased in the direction of awarding custody to mothers, even in cases where the mothers in some instances are not what the child needs. In the documentary that I'm going to show you a clip from here, a man talks about this 14-year custody battle that he had with his son over with his wife, who trapped him into having a child. He said that he didn't want to have kids with her until she got counseling for her anger management issues, but she got pregnant because she stopped taking her birth control. And then after the child was born, used him as an economic and political prop in order to get her way in the relationship. We're not going to watch that clip specifically, but this is not a far-fetched or uncommon thing that happens. I'll give you a few moments to keep writing, and then I will show you about 10 minutes from this documentary. And then we'll go on to describe a little bit more of what Farrell has to say in this book, and then we can have a discussion about all this and see what you think. Because this is a controversial issue, right? This is a touchy subject.
But it's important to be discussed, you know.
Farrell certainly thinks so.
I agree with you.
He thinks that we should be taking a more honest, holistic approach to this whole social critique that people have been engaging in for the last 60, 70 years. Okay.
How would Farrell define feminism, I guess?
Feminism is the movement to establish equality for women. But when it comes to giving women advantages over men, that's where Farrell says, I don't support that brand of feminism.
Would you argue that we should talk about this more, especially because of the women's rights movement last century, and how if we're talking about women and their rights, then we're sort of forgetting about men's rights as well?
Sure. Yeah, that's certainly an idea that's kind of contained in his analysis here, yeah. And he was a big supporter of the women's liberation movement, as you'll see. He still is. We would argue that he's still a feminist, but that he's also trying to highlight issues that men face as well. So it's going to take a moment for this projector to come on, but then we'll watch a little bit of this clip here. And this documentary interviews quite a few different men's rights activists.
Always so attentive to men. In fact, for years he focused almost exclusively on women's issues, rubbing shoulders with feminist leaders like Gloria Steinem. And he's still a card-carrying member of the National Organization for Women.
I believe that women cannot hear what men do not say.
And he's got a lot to say to both men and women in his provocative new book, The Myth of Male Power.
I was making a very significant amount of money speaking around the world on behalf of women's issues alone. I went through a period of forming men's groups, and then when I listened to them, I thought, well, gee, this will be really helpful to present to audiences so that they can understand not only women's side, but men's side too, because I was really totally in the feminist camp. And immediately I saw my standing ovations drop. I started hearing that there was people saying, don't invite him there, to speak with us. And pretty soon I had, very few college and university speaking engagements.
How did you originally get involved with feminism? Where did that all begin?
I was doing my doctorate in political science at NYU in the late 60s, and the women's movement surfaced. And I started to say, this is the most exciting thing I've ever heard, because I heard civil rights, gay rights, but suddenly women were saying, I don't want to be confined to just being a homemaker or a secretary. And so it's like, why shouldn't women be encouraged to do everything they possibly can do? And at that point in time, I saw a lot of women marrying men that they weren't completely in love with, but the man earned a fair amount. And so I thought, that's just a form of prostitution extended over a lifetime. How depressed that must make a woman. And it's not going to be good for a man either. He never knows whether he's loved for who he is or loved for what he has. And he's afraid to give up producing because he's afraid to lose love. And so women who were successful, to me, appeared to be women who would free men from having to be all, wrapped up in just being the only breadwinner and supporting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, which, it's one thing to support yourself. When you're supporting 5 people, you don't have the freedom to question your boss because you're supporting 5 people.
The first issue of feminism was to say, just because I'm a woman, maybe I don't want to spend my life raising children. You know, don't force me into that role against my will. So they looked at men and said, well, you're not forced to raise children, you don't have any issue. But for men, the traditional sex role was not raising children. For us, the traditional sex role is to be a provider, a protector, and to initiate relationships. Each of us has traditional sex roles. Don't force us to carry out those traditional sex roles.
We have the same rules set up for men that they've always lived by, that you need to protect and provide at any cost. But we've changed everything where it concerns women. They now have access to everything men have always had access to education, to work, to whatever they want to do. But they're not the ones driving the semis. And they're not the ones in the coal mines. You don't hear the National Organization for Women complaining that there is just not enough female ditch diggers. It is still men carrying the lion's share for what it takes to operate and maintain this society. And it is still the expectation that if somebody's going to go down with the ship, it's going to be men.
Flexibility in roles is where we should be all headed. Any men's rights activist that I would support the portions of the women's movement that is encouraging women to have more flexibility in roles.
So where do the men's movement and feminism disagree?
Well, only on the fundamental belief that the women's movement says men are the oppressors, that we are involved in a patriarchal world in which men invented the rules to benefit men at the expense of women.
But don't we live in a patriarchy? When most of the world's nations still have never had a female leader. And less than 5% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women.
You have to look at this in a larger perspective. Patriarchy is the result of gender roles and not the vice versa.
Traditionally, women's power and responsibility has been in the reproductive sphere, while men's power and responsibility was in the productive sphere. You know, you have to reproduce to continue the species, and you have to produce to feed people so that they can reproduce. So, you know, it's like they work together.
And most cultures divvied up roles because women were responsible for childbirth and were more likely to breastfeed. Well, they're not more likely to, they did the breastfeeding. They tended to be involved in the role of raising children. Men tended to be involved in the role of raising money or making a killing of the animals or making a killing on Wall Street. But those were our obligations.
So that's why industry was male-dominated and government was male-dominated, because that was our job.
And so what we call patriarchy is men giving into the expected roles that they're supposed to give into, and many of those roles are very harmful. Working exceptionally long hours, difficult hours, dangerous jobs, getting killed on the job. Even politics, a lot of people describe as masochism.
Imagine what it takes to be a successful politician. Imagine how much of your personal life that you give up, how much you work, how much privacy that you sacrifice, how much freedom in your day-to-day life that goes out the window. There are more men willing to do those things than there are women.
But also, just because men are the ones, for instance, writing the laws in general, doesn't mean that the laws are protecting men.
you hear about patriarchy, right? All the evils of the world's from patriarchy, but we're the ones dying. You know, and we die for you guys. You know, to protect our families, our friends.
In every society that's ever existed, women have had privilege and protection that men did not.
For example, we never hear about how men were excluded from the Forced Labor Convention of 1930 for years. The Forced Labor Convention was an international treaty that banned slavery and forced servitude, but it made an exception for able-bodied males ages 18 to 45. Eventually, they got rid of that, but there was still an exemption for prisoners and military, which is 90% male.
Stop pretending that you're oppressed and men are your oppressors. It's a lie, and it's a hurtful lie, and it's a hateful lie, and it's wrong.
Okay. So I just want to put a few more pieces of evidence that Farrell lays out on the board for the different ways that men are disadvantaged, and then we can have a big discussion about all this. How does that sound?
Groovy, man.
Groovy, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
So the next thing that Farrell discusses in this first chapter is about how men are expected to take on these certain roles, but they're given little to no appreciation for the voluntary work that they do engage in. That is, they receive a lot of criticism for what they do, but little to no gratitude or appreciation for the ways in which they're holding society up. For example, men on average work more hours than women do per week. Men take on basically all of the dangerous jobs: coal mining, construction, oil drilling, logging, garbage collecting, etc.
I'd argue that I feel like they kind of do that to themselves. Like that one guy's like, yeah, you see, we're all these men are dying for you. We're doing it for you. We're, protecting you. And I feel like in some ways, I'm not saying that's like in every situation, but I feel like a greater majority of the time men are like, okay, I gotta do this for the women. Like I'm doing this to save them. And it's like, well, are you really saving us though? You know what I mean? Like you're kind of doing that to yourself. And I feel like it's not necessarily needed sometimes.
You're right, it is voluntary. But why do you think men decide to do that?
Because they feel they're obligated, but I don't think they're
right.
obligated.
And why do you think women have abided by their traditional sex roles for how many years that they did? Because they felt obligated.
Yeah.
Right? So there are obligations that both men and women feel, social pressures that they feel to think and act in certain ways. Right?
Which is wrong. And sad.
Men make up almost the entirety of all workplace deaths. And you can think about it this way. Men are expected and take on the role of personal bodyguard for their significant others for free for their entire lives. I do feel morally obligated to protect my girlfriend because I know I'm stronger than her, that I can defend her more appropriately than she can defend herself. Men feel this obligation men step into this role to be the personal bodyguards of their girlfriends and their wives for free, forever. Should men have to do that? What all of this reveals, Farrell thinks, is again, not that we live in a matriarchal society, but that men and women are disadvantaged in different ways, and men and women are privileged in different ways. The picture is a lot more complex than a lot of progressivist feminist theory makes it out to be. Because society, broadly, what has been going on, the different social and traditional sex roles that we have, the obligations that we feel placed on us, were created and imposed on us by both men and women. So society isn't a patriarchy, it isn't a matriarchy. Farrell would say it's a patriarchy in some respects and a matriarchy in some respects. And that the hierarchical kind of organization that we have in society, and the people who are holding positions of power and authority, though that state of affairs is the result of both men's and women's decisions. It's not as if men are making up all the rules for themselves for the disadvantage of women, but rather the state of affairs that we have now has been constructed by both men and women, unconsciously in a lot of respects, or you might say subconsciously. So this is the kind of view that Farrell is trying to lay out in this book, in which he tries to not only paint what he thinks is a more holistic picture of what's going on in society, but encourage men to actually speak up about their life experiences, about the obligations and expectations that they feel are placed on them by their parents, by their families, by society. Okay.
Alright, so him saying that it's too simplistic to look at it as it's just a patriarchy, that's it. I feel like it's too simplistic to look at it like men have problems, women have problems, that's just how it is. Like the whole thing about like feminism is, you know, looking at the power structure of the patriarchy, sort of deconstructing that and like what is causing these problems through that power structure. And like even that clip where the guy is like looking at that poster board that he printed out where it's like patriarchy but we're all dying, he's so close to understanding that like patriarchy is the reason for those problems. It's that power structure that caused all of this. So I think Farrell is like correct on a lot of the things that he's saying are problems, but I think he's incorrect in what he thinks the source is. Because I'm not very clear on what he thinks the source of all of this is. It seems like he's just I don't think he's taking into consideration that like the power structure that's existed for centuries has been in favor of men, has been in favor of higher class, has been in favor of white people. Like he's not taking into consideration like he's stating that like there have been these long-standing gender roles, but he's not he might understand, but like he's not really taking into consideration who has been in power for that long, even if those gender roles have been like established in both sides.
So he would say that the source of all of this is the set of men's and women's decisions. So even though you're putting forth a view that says that men have the power, he would say actually men and women have power in different areas of life. When it comes to the way the home is set up and how the home is run, he would say that the woman normally has more power in the home, whereas the men normally have more economic power because they're the ones normally working the higher paying jobs, or more power when it comes to social status or being in a formal position of authority or something like that. But when it comes to the upbringing of kids, the education of children, over 75% of all teachers in the US are female. So who has a stronger grip on what the next generation is going to be like, men or women? It's a good question, right?
But, okay, so they might not be teaching the children, but they're making the laws. They're like...
True.
I just...
Yeah.
There might be like the home part where women have traditionally had more power, but like in almost every other aspect, like political, economic, just across the board, like men have been in power, and that's, I think, by and large, where a lot of the problems that he lists comes from, not necessarily what he's saying.
Okay. Yeah, he would say, again, it's going to depend on how we define power. He defines it as control over one's life. And if we define it in that way, it's not clear who has more power, men or women. Because you could interpret the kind of nuclear family patriarchal structure that we have now as actually giving a lot of power to women because they don't have to work. They don't have to worry about going to a job. They don't have all of this leadership responsibility or decision-making responsibility. This is the typical patriarchal, right, family structure. But then the feminists will say, well, no, because they don't have the money that a man has, or they don't operate the same role in a government or an institution that a man has, that she doesn't have any control over her life. But Farrell would say, I don't know about that. If we define power as control over one's life, and men are the ones dying, men are the ones suffering all these illnesses and diseases, who really has control over their life? Maybe neither. yeah, maybe neither. Steph, yeah.
Okay, so you said you don't really get where the source of his ideas comes from. I feel like it stems from like social expectations and like obligations of previous generations. I feel like that's kind of the main source of these ideas.
Which become re-legitimized and reproduced by the decisions of men and women, Farrell would say, not just men.
They influence them majorly. So.
But you're right, it has been men making the laws, right? Until women started, saying, men, you should make different laws for us, right? And then some stuff changed.
One case I want to talk about my mom. Love my mom. She was a microcircuit specialist at Lockheed Martin. Basically made radars for the Navy. Good for her. She was so smart. Oh my gosh. In her area, specifically, she was the only woman to work on her machine. And she was consistently made fun of for that. Even up until 2020 when she passed, even up until then. When I was born, she was relentlessly made fun of at work. My dad would consistently talk about having to stand up for her when she was not there, because all of a sudden she was really soft because she was a mom.
Right, yeah.
So, in many cases, when women enter those workspaces, typically owned by men, they're shut out of it. Either actually limited in getting those positions, or in the sense that they can have those positions, but they get to deal with all of that, backlash towards
harassment
them.
Or whatever it is, yeah.
Harassment, exactly. So, and even to this day, from what I've known from my mom's past coworkers, is that one, there has not been another woman to work on that machine and do the work that my mom has done. And two, apparently her area used to, for 20 years while she worked there, made the best numbers in Pennsylvania, Jersey. Since she's passed, her area has not ever hit half those numbers. So obviously it's not, it's something's wrong there.
Right. Yeah, and Farrell would say, yeah, that's shitty and there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
He would totally agree with you. And I think he would lament the discrimination that women have faced throughout history. He would say that the roles that we have that are impressed upon people now formed primarily due to survival at the beginning of the human species. But now that we've, cultivated a certain mastery over nature, we should allow people flexibility in these roles. Perhaps flexibility in gender. Perhaps flexibility in thought and behavior in all these different ways. Do y'all agree with him on that? That we should be not forcing people to take on these roles, no matter if it's a man or a woman?
Yeah, it should be the person's decision, you know what I mean?
Or do you still feel like your boyfriend should pay for dinner?
Yeah, societal structure would kind of fall apart without these preconceived positions, I guess. Because, like, say, for instance, there's a lady being harassed by somebody on the street, and this big jack dude walks up like, yeah, that dude should maybe protect me, or something like that, but he just walks on by. I feel like that would cause a little bit of the deconstruction and everything that we sort of know. That's just a simple example, but it could be extended.
Would that be good or bad?
Depends on who the person
I mean,
is.
bad for the woman, I guess, who's being harassed, but...
I think that just takes into the toll of kindness in a situation like that. Are the people subjugated to be kind to others because they expect something in return, or are they just doing it in general? So, well, it goes back to what we're saying about everybody's doing it for selfish reasons.
Yeah.
The other ideology that we talked about, but.
Right, and then you wonder, is it the case that, we have the kind of system that we do now because everybody is self-interested and they're trying to, do the best for themselves? In which case it would look like either women have gotten the raw end of the deal, or a lot of women actually like the system that we have, which a lot don't currently, so there's something weird going on there. Or is it the case that the society that we've constructed for ourselves has been done because we're trying to do something for the other person in a lot of cases? The guy said, we're dying for you, we're going to war for you, to protect our families, to protect our wives. There's probably a German truth in both of those views, right? I don't think anybody does anything purely altruistically or purely selfishly a lot of times, but...
Yeah, I can agree with you on that. I feel like, again, back to the whole decision thing, I'm gonna play politics.
Which thing?
Well, like, if we get to decide whether or not we wanna take on the role.
Okay.
And you know what I mean, and the caregiver and all that.
Yeah.
To play politics, I feel like, yeah, it's America, you should be able to decide, you know what I mean? If we're thinking of freedoms and all of that, and the right to choose, and the First Amendment and shit, I know, I'm playing this weird, but like, you should be able to decide, I guess. But as society goes, and as it's gone for years, we're gonna keep following that same path because that's how generations before us did. So.
I love the idea of freedom and flexibility for people in these roles, but I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think women are going to step voluntarily into the bricklaying and the ditch digging and the garbage collecting and the logging and construction jobs?
I mean, I would, because, like, why not try it out, I guess, but also, like, help the people, so, I mean, but I'm not gonna say I can't speak for every woman personally, so they maybe would, maybe wouldn't, it depends on the person and how they feel about, sacrificing their life, their time, their work, etc., all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
To go off of that, I feel like it's like women just aren't expected to do that by society, like what we're saying again, so it's like, because they're the caregivers,
they're kind of expected to be teachers or mothers, right? Or
yeah, and like I feel like men's issues, it's just really sad because it's like, it's a fact, like what the men said, like it's not a lie that women have been systematically oppressed by men, but like women aren't oppressing men. I think men are kind of past generations, men's laws are like oppressing men today.
Okay.
And I think I just feel like both have gotten comfortable in the past ways that society's like expected us to be, so like I feel like, and also like men have never, especially I feel like it's a very like white view, I feel like they're not talking about like men of color, because I feel like that's a whole different issue that I feel like he might not have like touched upon,
yeah, it's actually funny you bring that up, because if anybody did the reading, there's a very controversial part of it at the very end. Did you do the reading? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it was
He,
tasteless.
he compares the plight of men to the plight of African American slaves.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so what he says is, if you actually look at both of these groups, if you look at both of these groups, this is what he says.
That's rough.
Yeah.
Both African American slaves and men have risked their lives so that society might benefit economically and socially. Both have died to make the world safe and for the freedom of others. Both have their children involuntarily taken away from them. Both were conditioned to be subservient to others. And both are more likely to be homeless, imprisoned, and eschew or drop out of college. And the reason he's saying this is because he says, look, we recognize this is racist and bad. Why don't we recognize that what's being done to men is sexist? That's the general point he was trying to make, right? But
I don't know if this makes sense or like it goes along with like what we're talking about in men's roles, but like my dad, he had like a pretty high up job for like a while. We had to actually move to Memphis, and he was never really home, constantly traveling, constantly stressed, just a lot. And he resigned from his position due to some issues like in 2020, and he's had a hard time finding a job like as like not like high, but just it's hard to find a job in his old position. And
sure,
it's like weird you say about the roles, because like we're noticing like ever since like he hasn't had that job, it's like because it was so strenuous and like intense, like it was his whole identity, and now he doesn't, we're noticing like doesn't really know what to do with himself, like hobbies or you know, stuff around the house, like, and like because my mom, like that's, he couldn't really have a life outside of this job. He kind of lost himself in it. Like even when it did come to friendships, it was more just talking about, you know, work-related coworker stuff. And I just feel like that's not that it's like oppression, but like it's part of the whole like there is issues when it comes to like having men in certain positions where they, I guess they don't get to like grow as much in different ways than women, I guess.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, we might not call it oppression, but we would say that he felt some sort of expectation or pressure, right, to provide and work these long hours, even if that was.
That's what he said. My mom was like, well, you know, you need to like start like, you know, doing other things. And he's like, well, I've done for 30 years, and it's like you can tell like it's starting to come out that he's not like guilting, but like making like us understand like he felt the need to.
He felt like he had to do it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And we talk about, with regards to feminism, women facing the same pressures, right? Or similar pressures, that they feel like they need to adhere to these roles, they need to adhere to a certain life path, they have certain expectations placed on them. If we can recognize that that's bad for women, can we also recognize that that's bad for men too? Yeah, you.
Okay. So I want to, okay, so the whole idea of why men might face like scrutiny, you know, if that's probably the right term I want to use, but I can't think of a better term. What, at least in our society, what's seen as like a weak man? Like someone that isn't physically strong, someone that isn't the breadwinner, all these traits that
living
are
at home with their parents.
Exactly.
You know,
being the stay-at-home dad, you know, those traits are traditionally feminine things. You know what I mean? So I think it goes back to this whole idea of men can't be feminine because that makes them too similar to women. You know what I mean?
Or it makes them weak in a sense.
Yeah, but what's traditionally seen as weak? Women. You know?
That's interesting, yeah.
So that's how I look at it, is that, well, it's still this attack on femininity. And even within the feminist movement, let's talk about that. Many women who want to be that stay-at-home mom, they want to be that teacher, are looked and criticized for, well, why don't you strive for more? Well,
Right.
Maybe they want to be that. You know what I mean?
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Nowadays, it seems like what we're seeing is the masculinization of women. Women are told to be bossy and forward, right, when they're in a job, to be assertive, to be stubborn. Is this not just trying to project masculine traits on women traits and saying that they'll be better off if they do this? Isn't that weird?
Yeah. I don't know if that's fair to say that the traits of being assertive and stubborn are all just masculine traits, but that's not what I was going to go with. Okay, so you mentioned the whole end of the story and what he wrote, and I feel like that's not fair to necessarily compare the struggles of men to slaves, because like slaves went through much harsher shit.
Sure.
And they had to sacrifice their lives, and I don't think that's, like, I get the comparison, I just think it's rough.
Right. It's definitely not a perfect
They're
comparison.
Yeah, I don't think it's like ethically right in a way, but.
But then what he ends up saying is, we recognize that all this was racist and bad. Now let's look at the plight of black men in U.S. society and show how they have it worse off than black women in a lot of different ways. And he says there the sexism is easier to see than when you look at the lives of white people, which is an interesting point.
I think it's hard to like separate like issues of like patriarchy with other like forms of power like class and racism.
Yeah.
Because to the example that they had up there about like sort of like the like prison industrial complex, like where people are put to work in prisons, and they're saying that it's mostly men. I feel like the issue isn't necessarily like feminism or patriarchy there, it's more so class. It's benefiting the capital owners. It's not about because it's not like, oh, we should have women also be forced into labor in prison. Like that's not the idea. It's you want to have that eradicated. It's and that's more of a class thing than it is a like a gender or whatever sort of problem. And I think the same thing sort of falls into like stuff about like intersectionality about like black men. It like a lot of it has to do with racism, not necessarily sexism. It's I don't know. I feel like it's hard to just look at this as one problem and not really take into consideration other parts of society.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think Farrell would also be sympathetic to that. I think he would say, yeah, there is racism, there is homophobia, there are these other forces, class forces, economic forces that are affecting all of this. Yeah.
I'd like to say too that in the video that one guy's like, yeah, there's no females that are tool workers and whatever else he said. And I thought that was unfair to point out because there probably are that we just don't know, but it's a less percentage. And also, you're being a men's right advocate, but you're also being sexist towards women, which I don't think is right because you're thinking of men, but you're not taking into account females. So, like, what the hell, buddy? So that's what I have to say on that.
Right. Actually, I'd like to end on this point. What time does class end?
12:50.
12:50. Okay, good. We have about 10 minutes left. I just want to go over one thing. So the clip from the documentary I showed you is about men's rights activists, what are called MRAs. Okay? If you do any research into people that are trying to change the story that feminism is giving to people about men being oppressors and men having all the power and women having no advantages in society, there are a bunch of different groups that will show up if you go down this rabbit hole. And they're not the same. So the documentary, the clip that I showed you, was about men's rights activists. And these people, obviously they're bad people in any group, right? Wackos, weirdos, extremists, radical people. But by and large, this group is trying to raise awareness about the specific issues that men and boys face. And they're trying to provide solutions to these things. Such as, everything that we've been putting on the board that disproportionately affects men. Not activities. Gosh, I'm just terrible today.
Close, but not quite.
It's okay, it's Monday and we forgive you.
It is Monday. Then there's a group of men, and you'll find them talking online in forums and stuff, that's known as MGTOW. Does anybody know what MGTOW means? MGTOW? This stands for men going their own way. And these people basically believe that a lot of the problems that men have in their life are due to women. And so they're trying to cut off women and not have any relationships with women and just live alone by themselves.
Oh, hell no, man.
And then you'll find a group, if you go further down the rabbit hole, that are called red pillars. And these are people who generally try to weaponize evolutionary psychology to gain women and to try to be pickup artists and to have a lot of sex. And so you'll see these groups conflated with one another a lot, but they are distinct. They're distinct communities. So if you ever come across, some of these views, you might want to do some research into who you're actually reading, and what they are for. Because I would argue, this makes sense. I don't know about these. Right? Yeah.
Didn't the name come from the documentary?
That's the name of the documentary, but
Is it about
the original concept came from the Matrix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. You can see reality for what it is.
It hurts.
So does anybody have any comments or questions about what we talked about today? Any final things you want to say?
I'm gonna sound bad. So the red pillars are kind of like nymphomaniacs. They just want to have sex, and that's just it at the end.
They want to
You know what I mean?
score
They look at-
points by having sex with a lot of women.
Yeah, so they look at
and
women
being
as
alpha
objects.
males and being cool.
They look at women as objects and not people, and that's dehumanizing.
A lot of them do, yeah. I don't know if all of them do, but.
I think another aspect of it, at least from what I understand, is they blame women for them not having sex, which is
also
insane. But like,
Women don't like nice guys anymore.
Yeah, it's very much that.
Don't throw their guns.
It's very reactionary.
In fact, a lot of the strategies that they employ in order to hook up with women involve insulting them and putting them down and things like that.
Yeah.
Because that works, they say.
What assholes.
So, anybody have any final comments? We'll end it on this funny note. Okay. Well, thank you for coming. I know this was a controversial thing to discuss, but I hope you talk about this with your friends. Because if we don't talk about this, we're all going to be worse off, I think. If we are after flexibility in roles, people need to be made aware of the expectations and social impositions that are bearing down on both